My name is Vidhi and I'm delighted to welcome you to the third Vidhi annual lecture. The first two editions of this lecture were delivered by Justice Ruma Pal and Justice Charameshwar, and I'm very happy to have with us today Justice Gautam Patel of the Bombay High Court. Welcome, sir. The lecture is the highlight of Vidhi's annual calendar. Apart from the evening of intellectual stimulation it offers us, it's also a welcome relief for Vidhi fellows because we have someone else doing the hard work. And it's the culmination of a series of events that we've had over the past week where different teams at Vidhi have been sharing the work that they've been doing over the last year. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the organization, we're an independent legal think tank that does legal research and assists government in drafting better legislation. We work in a variety of different areas, and over the last week we've hosted roundtables on the digital transformation of the news media, a conference on justice efficiency and transparency, another conference on the insolvency and bankruptcy code and its impact on markets and the economy, and this morning a consultation on a model end-of-life care law. I mean, to those of you though whom I think that our work involves huddling up in conferences and debating highly specialized issues of the law, I'm happy to be able to share with you today a more exciting and adventurous part of our work. So my colleagues Devaditya, Shama, Yogini and Isha have been working very hard over the last 6 months to track the implementation challenges with environmental judgments on the ground. They've travelled from Kaziranga to Joshimath in Uttarakhand to Patancheru in Hyderabad, have interviewed many dozens of petitioners and survivors of environmental damage, and with the help of Riverbank Studios are creating a film that will make the challenges with the monitoring and enforcement of environmental law more alive and hopefully make environmental problems seem more urgent than they appear. So we're happy to share with you the teaser of this film today. I'll just play that for you.
सुबह 5 बजे जब देखा तो पूरा जलमग्न हो रखा था।
अभी देखिए ये मकान दबाव, आप यकीन नहीं कर सकते ये मकान,
और वो दृश्य मैं अब याद नहीं करना चाहती हूँ।
हमने एनजीटी में केस डाला, एनजीटी के दबाव की वजह से उन्होंने एक रिपोर्ट बनाई।
जो लोग आज भी इंतजार में बैठे हुए जो हमारा नुकसान हुआ है वो मिल जाए,
जितना भी जो है सारा आप तक है बिल्डिंग, ये अभी तक ऐसे ही पड़ी है।
The legal battle has given a lifeline to the polluters than to the people.
Every household is facing many problems.
Supreme Court has given several judgments. Partially, some of these have been implemented.
हमारा सूरत 40 साल है, अभी मेरा सूरत देखो कैसे हो गया, हमारा बच्चे लोग कैसे होना, उन लोग कैसे जिंदा।
और दिल्ली एनसीआर में वायु प्रदूषण की स्थिति बेहद खराब हो गई है।
It's polluted due to activities of all 1300 million people of the country together.
ग्रीन अपना आइटम है, देखिए बस बोल दिया ग्रीन चलो।
किसी भी सुप्रीम कोर्ट के जज ने आज तक एक पटाखा नहीं फोड़ा। एक सुप्रीम कोर्ट के जज के पास कम से कम 5 गाड़ियां जो कितना पोल्यूशन करती हैं, उसके ऊपर रोक नहीं है।
Its impact I am seeing every day.
If you look at the plans that Delhi has right now, they're all a random, assorted, mixed up laundry list. Diapers, menstrual waste, showers, broken glass, all of that is mixed up and shown away in the waste, routinely.
दिल्ली में सूखा और गीला के आप बात कर रहे हैं, हमारे यहाँ कहीं कहीं होता है और कहीं कहीं नहीं होता है। दिल्ली में जिसका कोई साथ नहीं मिला।
भी आती है, हाथी भी आता है।
इंसान के पास कुछ ऑप्शन बचता नहीं है, then I feel judiciary is the only option where one could approach. हमें एक लाइन ड्रॉ करनी पड़ेगी कि एनिमल्स का एरिया कौन सा है और ह्यूमंस का एरिया कौन सा है।
The court has no time to hear.
We don't have a list of priorities.
But what should one do? The activity still continues.
Unless the court cannot go and arrest the whole country.
They have not given us everything that we asked for, but then that is not expected also.
Yeah. And I'm especially glad that Justice Patel was here today to see the trailer with his stellar record of appearances in environmental matters, from the preservation of the Sanjay Gandhi National Park to open spaces in Bombay to the protection of mangroves. And I'm sure that he'll have plenty to say on whether entrusting environmental matters to the judiciary over the executive is like choosing between a rock and a hard place. Incidentally, a choice that he will also be making us confront in his lecture today, titled Between Scylla and Charybdis, Institutional Autonomy in Democratic Governance. Not only does Justice Patel have a distinguished record on environmental issues, he received the first international fellowship at the Pacific Energy and Resources Center and worked with the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund. He's also from my alma mater, Government Law College, Mumbai, and so I'm doubly honored to be able to introduce him to you today. He has brought a breath of fresh air to the judiciary with his frank, empathic and introspective writing in a wide range of publications, from the Economic and Political Weekly to Time Out Mumbai to the Mumbai Mirror, and I'm sure he will bring the same kind of whiff of fresh air, much needed in Delhi in more senses than one, with his lecture today. So I'd like to invite you on stage, please, to hear.
Good evening. It is a privilege to be here. The Vidhi Center for Legal Policy's two previous annual lectures were by Justice Chiraneshwar and Justice Rumapal, and that makes this invitation a very special honor. My thanks to R.K. Gupta and his team at Vidhi. My topic today is a difficult one. I have attempted to shape it as best I could, but there is at least one thing I cannot and will not be doing. Reciting which judgment of which court of how many judges said what, even if time permitted it, which it does not. And while it is the stuff of much entertainment for judges and lawyers, I imagine most would find it very dull indeed. History, culture, art, liberty, constitutional rights and freedoms, in a word, everything that defines us or should define us, are among the most fundamental issues that affect any body politic. These should be the subject of constant grappling and continued discourse. Not only is the space for this kind of discourse shrinking in this country, but, and perhaps more troubling, the discourse itself is increasingly regarded as irrelevant. It is not. The general term discourse can indicate a limitless palette. In any truly civil society, it means a dialogue, an exchange, a conversation. A meaningful discourse has two or three essential requirements. First, it must be civil. As Justice Chandrachud wrote in a judgment delivered when he was a judge of the Bombay High Court, the discourse of law is the discourse of civility. This is true of every discourse and every conversation. But increasingly, expressions and outpourings of anger, venom, and vitriol, both in speech and in writing, seem to have edged out all semblance of discourse. We do not have conversations. We have tirades and shouting matches, and I do not have to tell you where you can most regularly view them night after night. As William Davies writes in Nervous States, Democracy and the Decline of Reason, the requirement or mandate of civility in discourse, especially scientific discourse, is well established. It was a norm with the Royal Society, whose members were obliged to be respectful with each other and never violent in speech or deed. There evolved a style of debate in the Royal Society, Davies says, that was marked by sharp disagreements, but always polite. These modes of etiquette, he says, which have evolved into contemporary norms of scientific speech, serve to keep personal identities and feelings out of the space of disagreement. Throwing them back in, for instance by suggesting an expert is motivated by some personal ambition or grudge, is the main strategy of those wanting to discredit the scientific establishment. He goes on to mention that digital and online media are a gift to those opponents, stretching the ideal of objective criticism to breaking point. Second, a conversation is not just about talking. It is also about listening, and the best conversations are had with those who are close listeners. Today, nobody is really listening, and nobody is really being civil. There exists a fabulous repository of civil discourse, and it is right here with us. When courts deal with deep constitutional issues, they often go back nearly 7 decades to the Constituent Assembly debates. I assure you, on almost any aspect of constitutional law one cares to name, the records of these debates make for the most engaging reading. It is impossible not to come away feeling enriched and rewarded, not only by the quality of thought, but also by the manner of its expression, and the realization that when you dive into the record of these debates, you see dazzling displays of intelligence, insight, foresight, and sagacity. The Constituent Assembly had nearly 300 indirectly elected representatives. It included people from all manner of backgrounds and cultures and political dispositions, from conservative industrialists to Hindu revivalists and radical Marxists. In that composition itself lies a lesson in plurality for us today and what it really means to be broad-based and inclusive. For me, the revelation was that not all, or perhaps not even most of these members had any legal training. In some debates, the members are heard to say so. In others, we hear them speak of having little to no formal education at all. Yet, in discussions on article after article of the draft document, there were amendments proposed and debates had, each reasoned, voiced in measured tones, even when sentiments were strongly held and tempers ran very high. This is the temper of true discourse. The third facet is that a discourse is meaningful only when it has a focus and a starting point. As Davies says, it is impossible to imagine a democracy that doesn't feature disagreement. At the same time, no constitutional settlement can survive if everything is a value judgment or a matter of opinion. There must be some commonly agreed starting point that all are willing to recognize before democratic politics can begin. If therefore we simply say we should have more conversation or that we should have more civil discourse, this is less than helpful. We must know what it is that we are talking about in a civil manner with careful thought and listening, and why. I propose this evening to place before you one area that seems to me to have been almost entirely neglected in our contemporary conversations. I refer to the institutions of a democratic republic and their relationship with government and the people. Let me first say at the beginning that I do not refer to any particular government, nor to any particular policy, action or statute. My focus is on the political and legal theory underlying the functioning of institutions in a liberal democracy to show why a certain method of functioning is critical to the maintenance and survival of liberalism in a democratic republic, which is to say, a democracy not governed by the majority or the mob rule, but by the rule of law. Let me explain quickly what I mean by institutions. I do not only mean institutes, and I do not mean any particular organization. The term, at least for this evening, means a set of relatively formalized bodies that function under some statute or enactment with some regulatory oversight. In itself, this is also perhaps too broad. I do not propose this evening to address any aspects relating to the judiciary, the legislatures, or bodies like the Election Commission, the CAG, the Reserve Bank of India, and so on. I believe there are other institutions, which we will now begin to look at illustratively, that are just as important, many of which do not figure very much in our conversations. If they do, it is a momentary expression of being aghast or appalled at some momentary act. I will argue that these institutions and others like them are essential to the survival of a civil society in a constitutional system of governance like ours. I will attempt an explanation of why I strongly believe that it is imperative to accord these institutions this thing we will now discuss, autonomy. My argument is that autonomy, at least in the understanding of it that I will now present, is not merely desirable. It is fundamental to the preservation and continued existence of a democratic republic under the Constitution and under the rule of law. We must set this discussion in a contextual understanding of the word autonomy. It is widely misunderstood and much given to loose usage nowadays, mostly when talking about colleges and universities. There, autonomy means just being given a slightly longer leash. An autonomous educational institution is not freed from regulation, oversight, affiliation, recognition of the degrees it confers, and so on. It is not even entirely free in the admission process. Its so-called autonomy is restricted usually to course content and design, and perhaps conferring a degree. Is this autonomy? If it is it sufficient? But first, to the word itself. Autonomy is of relatively recent origin and coinage, around the 17th century CE. It is said to be derived from two words in classical Greek, autos for self and nomos for law. It therefore means the right or condition of self-government, independence, and importantly, freedom from external control or influence. In philosophy, particularly Kantian moral philosophy, it speaks to the capacity of an individual to act objectively or to an informed objective standard without being influenced or coerced. For bodies, therefore, it means self-governing or governing independently. It may be contrasted with its exact antonym, heteronomy, specifically acting on another's dictates. But this, though lexically accurate, is only partly useful for our purposes. It is not possible, I believe, to argue that institutional autonomy must mean the complete absence of regulation or oversight. That way lies only chaos and anarchy. It is also illogical, for many of the very institutions in question are themselves creatures of statute. To argue, therefore, that they should be totally free is meaningless. Institutional autonomy for today's purposes is therefore a reference to a concern of broad implication. The reference is not to an operational autonomy, but to a functional and even structural autonomy. It does not mean being anarchically free from oversight, but it does mean not hewing or being compelled to hew to any particular political or social ideology, most especially that of a government in power. This will serve as our working definition. No discussion on institutional autonomy can avoid a reference to what passes for the system of education in this country, particularly post-school. At the broadest level, even the most casual look around suggests that we have utterly lost our way. And education is not just the acquisition of technical skills and proficiency, yet it is to that we have reduced ourselves for the most part. The demands for technical courses grow, while those in academic disciplines shrink. To have a true education is to be steeped in a discipline, and perhaps more importantly, to acquire that elusive ability to constantly teach oneself, to be willing to be forever a student. It is not about copying or learning or applying only that which has been told to us. The perception is that we need more doctors, engineers, accountants, lawyers, but not historians, philosophers, mathematicians, economists, scientists in both the social and physical sciences. Now, couple this perception with that quintessentially Indian horror of money, and you have all the makings of an educational catastrophe. This decline began with the statutory prohibition on this thing called a capitation fee by colleges, particularly medical colleges. It refers to the administrations of these colleges charging an extra premium amount, sometimes disguised as a donation, as a condition to college or university admission and enrollment. Never mind that the terminology is inaccurate, that was our common understanding of it. There is nothing wrong per se with regulating or capping fees or preventing extortionate demands. That is not, however, where we stopped. In the 10 years between 1993 and 2003, the jurisprudential landscape relating to educational admissions went through an enormous metamorphosis. From the first 1993 Unikrishnan case and the 13 orders in the TMA Pai Foundation cases, the Supreme Court oversaw the structure of admissions in its entirety, including minorities, affirmative actions, and fees. In 2012, an 11-judge bench of the Supreme Court addressed, among other things, the extent of government regulation of private, professional, educational institutions. One of the matters that came up was the regulation of admissions themselves, seen as an extension of the fee regulatory regime. The court mandated a division between free seats and paid seats, and a common or centralized test, plus the allocation of college seats to students by an external agency. Cardinal to this conceptualization was that a student could not pick her or his college, and the college could not pick its student. The student could specify preferences, but was to be allotted a seat by a nodal agency. The National Eligibility and Entrance Test, or NEET, a successor to the All India Pre-Medical Test, came in 2012. Let me explain how this works. The government decides how many seats a college may have for any particular course. Exactly 15% of these are free for the college to fill in any way it wants, only 15%. One lawyer recently described this to our bench in Bombay as the college's bread and butter. It is more like caviar, but never mind. The remaining 85% is entirely controlled. There is a state level quota from that 85%. Within that, there are affirmative action reservations per class or category, different ones for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, what are called other backward classes, a truly horrible expression, nomadic tribes, and so on. Within each, there are then some form of regional restrictions. Maharashtra has been divided into 3 such regions for medical admissions. We have Marathwada, Vidarbha, and unbelievably, a region called the rest of Maharashtra. In the constitution, this is supposed to be an administrative division, but it has been engrafted into the college admission structure. An OBC candidate from the Vidarbha region is restricted to colleges in that region. The strangest thing in all this, as I said, is that no college has any say at all in who it will or will not admit or enroll in this 85%. All placements in that percentage are done and only done by some external government-run agency, and there is actually something called a matrix. This is a computer-generated prioritized listing. The student herself or himself has no option to select this or that college. She or he may indicate preferences, but then must accept whatever is allotted and go to that college or lose a year and try again in an exercise known as betterment. If this sounds bizarre, it is, and it has become the victim of unintended consequences. In the last academic year, several thousand seats in Maharashtra went unfilled. All these were in properly affiliated colleges, but all these colleges were outside the major metros. Within the major metropolitan areas, the problem was the reverse, overcrowding. Everyone wanted a college in Mumbai or Pune, and there was at least one case before us where the physical size of the classroom was too small to accommodate a randomly increased intake by the regulator. The increase was for no reason we could tell, with the result that students were standing in the corridors and hallways outside. 3 or 4 such highly fancied colleges went full. Others, because of their geographical locations, ran to empty rooms. This has a downstream effect because if a college does not fill its seat, its next year's intake might be reduced. This control extends to curriculum design too. In another case, there was a problem with one particular course, sculpture. This was not specifically mentioned anywhere, neither in the fine arts nor in the applied arts. And since all these courses are compulsorily approved, regulated and controlled by an all-India body, some 60-odd aspiring sculptors were left in this sculptural twilight zone, wanting to study it but unable to do so because it was not recognized or approved. This kind of top-down external structure, re-engineering, undermines educational institutional autonomy in a fundamental way. One can have no argument at all against some level of capping of fees to be charged, as I said, or on a reasonable direct affirmative action scheme. But to allow for this level of regulatory overreach presents another problem, one to which we have shut our eyes. The problem is this. What is being done in these institutes, of which there are vast numbers, is only a skill set training. That freeing and opening of a young student's mind, that expansion of horizons so essential to a true education, are eliminated by removing autonomy from the equation. Contrast this with any educational system in England or America, our two most sought-after educational destinations, even for those scrambling to get into our professional training institutes. Can you really imagine anyone telling the law, medicine or engineering schools at Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge that they can have no say in their student admissions and that who is to be admitted to which school or college will be determined by some state-controlled computer software? As I said, this reduces education to a technical skill acquisition exercise, and it reduces what should be centers of learning and education to little more than coaching classes. The contrast with the few islands of education that remain is startling. There are some that do still provide the true experience of learning and education. The IITs are one example, and they have been outside this deep admission dominance by the government for a long time. There are other examples as well, JNU and other universities here, and to some extent, some colleges and institutions in Bombay. The autonomy, and I speak now of the working definition with which we began, of these and similar institutions makes space for something I believe is integral to any education, to any system of teaching and learning: doubt. In a recent IIT Mumbai case before us, there was a question on a different issue, gender discrimination and harassment. But the backstory was that institute's explicit support for the right to speak freely, to doubt, to question, and to dissent. And that disagreement in the student body was entirely political, rooted in belief, ideology, faith, and an interpretation of secularism and liberty. This in an engineering institute. This commitment to a plurality of voices and space for dissent is crucial to any educational institution. The continuance of this commitment and its ideal, its maintenance and preservation, are tied hand and foot to the right of the institution to take an independent decision, hence autonomy, about the composition of its student body, given certain reasonable requirements. If you take away that right, I would argue, by an external determination of the student body, you take away the space and opportunity for this fundamental construct. Educational institutions throughout history have always been the crucibles and birthplaces of dissent and opposition, spaces for the positioning of countervailing perspectives. We know this since at least the 1960s in the US and possibly even earlier. This is what we mean when we speak of a liberal education. A liberal education does not end with a degree. It sets the tone and stage for a career and a lifelong engagement with new issues as they come up. If a true educational institution is the birthplace of liberal thought, then a life after and outside, and that includes governance, law and politics, is the battlefield for a continued defense of liberalism. It is for this reason that illiberal governments first target centers of education and learning. They leave the skill set training institutes alone. Those pose no threat, they cannot. But if you want to rid yourself of the troubles of dealing with doubt, dissension, and looking askance in daily governance, in a word, liberalism, it is best nipped in the bud, and what place better to quash it than in its breeding ground, centers of true education. This is the end of liberalism and the beginning of the end of what it means to be a democratic republic. It is also the beginning of something else, and I will come to that very soon. By the way, I wrote this several weeks ago, not yesterday. The most timeless and enduring defense of a liberal education and what it really means goes back to the 9 astonishing lectures delivered in 1852 by John Henry Cardinal Newman to the Roman Catholics of Dublin. Long considered one of the great masters of English prose, Newman's religious journey took him from Anglicanism to the Roman Catholic Church. These 9 discourses have been described as an epoch in the life of every college student. Historians rank it with Aristotle's Ethics as among the most valuable of all works on the aim and purpose of education. Newman's position, beautifully stated, was that a truly liberal education is founded on a knowledge of first principles and relations rather than mere facts. This, he argues, is the idea of a university, the best preparation for any career. Its attributes are freedom, equitableness, calmness, moderation, and wisdom. Liberal knowledge is not just utilitarian knowledge. True knowledge comes from investing facts or mere learning with ideas. A truly educated person is someone who is neither a man of mere information, one who generalizes nothing, nor the merely opinionated man, impatient with facts and therefore unreliable in his assertions. Newman spoke to an ideal, one of a clear, calm, accurate vision, and a comprehension of all things as far as the finite mind can embrace them, something to be achieved by the science of sciences. This is a quotation from the introduction in the University of Notre Dame's 1982 edition of the work. If divided in head and heart and crushed by his vastly multiplied learning, modern man studies or works in universities where specialists in the humanities are cut off not only from those in the sciences but even from one another, and where sometimes it almost appears that every student and every teacher is simply on his own, he might at first be inclined to dismiss an ideal like Newman's as the faded dream of a bygone age. Yet it is a dream that somehow persists, even now, in demanding to be lived. And we have in recent years seen our leading universities making intense efforts to integrate their students' learning so that it does become something like what Newman meant by knowledge. Today's student might well test his own university by asking himself what steps it has taken to encourage him at least to aim at its realization. In places of education and true learning, therefore, autonomy of the kind we define is at its most elemental and precious. Here, in these places, it speaks directly to constitutional values and freedoms. What about other institutions or other types of institutions? Instances abound, as we shall now very quickly see. But even the shortest survey of any of these leads us back to that same nexus between autonomy, dissent, liberalism, democracy, and the rule of law. Take the film certification board, that body we so often wrongly call the censor board. The entirety of the working ethos of this body is rooted in subjectivity. What film should fall into what class is always subjective. Our vocabulary in talking about it is distorted. It is emphatically not a censor board. It has no power to ban. That is a power reserved to government under a different law. It has the power and the duty to certify, and that means to classify. It can refuse to give any certificate at all, but it cannot ban. The Cinematograph Act, 50-year-old act which needs relook, provides general guidance, and there are also some broadly stated guidelines. But too often we see decisions that have no discernible linkage at all to these guidelines. Why have a guideline if one is not going to be guided? This is what prompts courts to interfere and to take over the board's function, because all that appears is quirky subjectivity. This is changing under the stewardship of Justice Sarin, who heads the appellate body. He has called for reasoned decisions, and I can only hope that his push succeeds. But even now, there are multiple instances of unreasoned and unreasonable decisions. The Controlling Act speaks of the opinion of the certifying authority, and then it sets out the yardstick for arriving at this opinion. Against the interests of the sovereignty and integrity of India, the security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency or morality, or involves defamation or contempt of court, or is likely to incite the commission of any offense. The section is intended, obviously, as a solution to this problem of subjectivity. It makes it clear that it is not any old opinion, but one to be reached for these reasons that must inform the certification decision-making process. Of these, the most difficult parameters are decency, morality, and the likelihood of incitement to an offense. In a word, just how much is too much? And what precisely are the qualifications of the certification board's members to take a call for a nation of over 1 billion people when it comes to what is decent or moral? Is showing skin indecent? How much skin? What body parts are we talking about? Is telling of an extramarital relationship immoral? Neither is rare or unknown in real life. Why should real life be the stuff only of candy floss? Life is as often raw, visceral, savage, and barbaric as it is beautiful and full of grace. And let us not forget this. Art imitates life. Therefore, we can no more control an artistic vision than we can control a human being's actions in reality. What the Act cautions the body to do is therefore be judicious and circumspect, and most emphatically, not to give vent to personal likes, dislikes, and prejudices. There is a case therefore to be made for less regulation, not more, and to do away with the power to order, that is to command, excisions or cuts in movies. No certification board should, I believe, ever indicate what should be cut. Why a director or author decides to portray something in a particular fashion is a question of a highly individualized artistic sensibility. Consider this. A close-up in a movie of a hand holding a cutthroat razor, slitting the held open eye of an animal, or is it a woman, and vitreous fluid spilling out. There is no plot to this work. Would we order a cut? Why? This is from one of the classics of world cinema, Louis Buñuel's Un Chien Andalou. Another example. A woman is gang raped, to keep her from revealing the identity of her assailants. They cut out her tongue and lop off her hands, replacing them with tree branches. When she is rescued and her rescuer begs her to reveal the identity of her attackers, she leans towards the camera and opens her bloodied mouth in a silent scream. Later in this very work, a king is asked whether a father should kill his daughter if she has been raped. The king agrees and says yes, she should. And the father snaps his raped and dismembered daughter's neck. What would we do with a work like this? Would we pause and ask ourselves if this is art or literature or merely gruesome and unnecessary bloodletting and mindless violence? The film is by Julie Taymor, her directorial debut. It features Anthony Hopkins and Jessica Lange. It is called Titus, and it is an adaptation of a work called Titus Andronicus, written by William Shakespeare. Would that make us change our mind? For the Film Certification Board, therefore, we have twin demands. A narrow tailoring of what it can and cannot do, and given that, a functional autonomy. A too amorphous latitude in the first leads to unacceptable subjectivity, and a lack of autonomy, the second part, brings us to unacceptable intrusions into artistic freedom. Again, to illiberalism and the stifling of dissent. When such autonomy is compromised by a real or perceived, externally imposed or self-imposed, adherence to what might or might not be palatable to those currently in power or to a particular political ideology, we are then headed in exactly the opposite direction from our constitutional mandate. We then have all the trappings of a fascist state. Authoritarianism can take different forms. It is most visible when imposed top-down, as we can so often see in brutal regimes. But the other way of undermining a society predicated on individual liberty is to eviscerate public institutions from the inside out. One way of doing this is, naturally, to compromise their independence in decision-making, that is to say, their autonomy. Jason Stanley's book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, is a superb and eminently readable analysis of the methods of this dismantling. Fascist states focus on dismantling the rule of law and replacing it with the dictates of individual rulers or party bosses, and incidentally, an independent judiciary is a favorite target. Tyranny, Stanley explains, referencing Socrates' argument in Book 8 of Plato's Republic, is often the result of a strong man seizing democracy's commitment to liberty and speech and using it against itself to consolidate his position and undermine democracy itself. The essence of fascism is its rejection of pluralism and tolerance. These are very real perils for any government. I would argue that any government, either explicitly or implicitly, demands this sort of fidelity is a government that before long is doomed to catastrophic collapse and oblivion. A liberal democracy founded on a constitutional precept is not just a concept. It is, as Tom Ginsburg and Aziz Haq say in How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, a matter of daily practice. This practice depends on a degree of institutional differentiation. The doctrine of powers, the separation of powers we all know, is one dimension of this. But it also depends on key institutions that are born from constitutional ideals and are to be informed by those ideals, remaining autonomous and true to the intent of their governing statutes, not to a malleable, immediate political expediency. Many of the most egregious transgressions of liberties come not from the leaders themselves, but from civil servants and bureaucrats tasked with policy implementation or governing this or that institutional body. Parallel to the Film Certification Board are our state-controlled cultural and art institutions. For the same reasons, they too must be allowed to function autonomously in service of their primary purposes. All art is political, and art is nothing if not discourse and dissent. If it is not that, it is just so much pap. The purpose of art in every form is to question, to doubt, to look askance, to disagree, and to present an alternative perspective. In a finely realized address in Bombay recently at a literary event, reviewing the purpose of different art forms and their relation to freedom, liberal democratic ideals, and constitutional values, Justice Chandrachud said that the libertarian idea of constitutional law wants all individuals to be autonomous and rational. Yet individual autonomy is fragile. Institutional autonomy needs to be made of stronger stuff. Conformity to a political or socio-ethnic ideology takes away dissent, and by prohibiting it in a designated art space, takes away the physical space for dissent. It must, I argue, be open to the director of a museum or an art institute to insist that an art or his work has value and meaning, even if it is directly opposed to or even questions or taunts a particular ideology or stated political intent. In India, this is perhaps much more important than we realize or acknowledge for one overarching reason. The single largest patron of the arts in India is the government. We do not have the kind of mammoth endowments that museums and art centers, especially in America, do. But a lack of financial autonomy must not ever be allowed to translate into a stripping of functional autonomy. If we permit that, we suppress and subjugate art. If we do that to prevent the articulation of an opposing or countervailing narrative or perspective, then we drive ourselves away from our stated constitutional ideals to a place of illiberal conformity. Here is my real problem with conformity and illiberalism. It is unspeakably boring. It is a land of pretty pictures, but nothing that will challenge, question, doubt, or disturb. Illiberalism speaks to a fulfillment of predictability, of only presenting the already known. Liberalism is about anticipation and the exhilaration of uncertainty, of not knowing what lies ahead. As Julian Barnes wrote so brilliantly in Flaubert's Parrot, the greatest pleasure in life is the pleasure of anticipation. Who needs to burst into fulfillment's desolate attic? There is one other institution to which I must make reference, and again, this is something I wrote 3 weeks ago. It is the statutory body constituted under the Right to Information Act. It seems to me utterly illogical and absurd that this body should be anything but autonomous, and possibly the most autonomous of all. Its primary target in its statutorily mandated work is the government itself. To alter its composition and curtail its remit so it serves the government rather than the people for whom it was meant is an unspeakable travesty. This approach is another inside-out damaging of institutional autonomy, and it achieves an authoritarian purpose while damaging the fabric of a liberal democracy. The right to know is a game changer, like the Right to Education Act, and it is a powerful check on government excess. To be sure, the Act can be abused, but the fact that a statute can be abused is only a call for a judicious approach in dealing with such attempted abuse, not a reason to jettison the rationale of the statute altogether. My argument today is that a government, any government, that claims to be dedicated to the Constitution, to democracy, and to liberalism has nothing at all to fear from according a wide functional autonomy to its institutions and their processes. The future of such a government is all but assured. Ideas are bulletproof. Dissent is what dissent does, and it takes no defined form and is therefore impossible to stamp out. A government that instead demands or even expects ideological conformity from its key institutions and thereby shrinks the space for dissent is an illiberal and undemocratic government that acts contrary to a fundamental tenet of our constitutionalism. Any government that demands such ideological conformity hunts the snark. It is a venture doomed to failure. Again, as I said at the beginning, this is not about any particular government or even any particular ideology, let alone any specific state action or enactment. It is about the need to engage with the theoretical underpinning of the importance of dissent and dissension in a liberal democracy, constitutionally required to be always subject to and under the rule of law. There are therefore the conflicting choices before us today. To one side is the perceived political threat that all dissent poses, whatever its form. On the other is the peril of a loss of liberalism, freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. Scylla and Charybdis were two mythical sea monsters from Greek mythology. They lay on either side of the narrow Strait of Messina between Sicily and Calabria. Scylla was a six-headed monster, or sometimes called a rock shoal, on the mainland, the Calabrian side. Charybdis was a horrific whirlpool off the coast of Sicily. Between them, they posed an inescapable threat to voyagers. Heroes from classical Greek mythology, including Odysseus and Jason, had to pass between these two perils. So do we today. Homer says Odysseus was advised to sail closer to Scylla, thus risking the loss of maybe a few sailors, rather than moving towards Charybdis and risk losing the whole ship. That is also our choice today. And the choice we make will determine not just our nation's future, but its survival. Thank you all again for being here and for your patience.
Thank you very much, Justice Patel. This is going to be a very hard act to follow because it's going to take a lot of time even for that lecture to sink in because nobody understood it. Because I think there's a lot going on in our heads. I'm delighted to have, that's why as on stage Mr. Arvind Datta, our senior advocate and who's a member of Vidhi's board, to help me through this task of processing Justice Patel's lecture. But maybe I'll start with the dilemma that you spoke of right at the end, between Scylla and Charybdis. And the issue that seems to me to be quite stark is that while the need for autonomy, which you've articulated very beautifully, is obviously paramount, there is also some need for institutional accountability, given the fact that institutions in India sometimes, when left autonomous, so that it is necessary, also don't function. How do you think we can think about getting this balance right?
Without specifics, I don't know how we can answer this, because to merely say that an autonomous institution doesn't function right doesn't tell me anything. I began by saying that I'm not advocating freedom from regulation or oversight at all, quite the contrary. I'm saying that within the governing statute, what an institution can or cannot do must be regulated, and it must have some oversight. It can't run completely amok. Of course, there has to be accountability, and if they start doing pretty random things on their own, that is something on which you must have a check. But take the IIT example. I'll explain this. This was actually a case of a Hindu versus Dalit flashpoint on campus. And there was no violence, and there was no disturbance, except that there was one group that took one view and another group that took the opposite view. And caught in between was the administration, which said, both of you can do this, can say your piece. You can print pamphlets, you can circulate pamphlets, but you will remain civil. You will not be disruptive, and you will not get personal about each other. In the course of this, what came to us in court was something that was so far an outlier that we couldn't believe what we were looking at. One of these students made an allegation against one of the professors who said this, really attacking her character and her sexuality. And that is what we had to deal with, not the background to it. And the institute said, look, you can have your debate, you can have your discussions, you can have your differences, but you can't attack an individual member of either the faculty or of the student body. That's, I think, a good balance that IIT of Bombay struck, and I think that gives you an idea of the autonomy I'm talking about.
That's right. So my follow-up to that is, to what extent is this autonomy or lack thereof in most cases that you illustrated? Take the Film Certification Board as an example of a structural failing, or is it simply often a failing of individuals?
For the Film Certification Board, it's both. I think that entire act needs a relook. It's a 1950 act. It's just time has moved on. We don't make movies the way we used to. Our concerns are not the same. And we have cases come to us where the certification board says, oh, this is not good, it will frighten my child. That's not an argument that anyone can work with. And it's also self-imposed, because a person who heads it suddenly feels that he needs to adhere to a particular line. So that's become a problem in itself.
That's right. So, Mr. Rathar, if I could turn to you on the question of the Right to Information Act, which Justice Patel briefly adverted to towards the end. I think we found that actually one of the Right to Information Act is an act that seems to have some ideological opposition from all organs of the state, and that includes the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, unfortunately. So, given that this is an institution which is meant to perform an important check and balance function and has to be autonomous, as he said, if autonomy is to have any meaning, where do we go in a situation where it seems that no organ of government wants to listen?
No, I didn't really follow your question. As far as the RT Act is concerned, I think that one of the most wonderful pieces of legislation that has come past. It has served lots of good, it has done human service in very many cases, including cases in court and tax cases and so on and so forth. But recently also they mentioned the question of abuse. And I find that there is a basic reluctance for anybody to question authority. So any question that is asked is diverted or not answered at all. And I find that at least my feedback is that the RT has become slowly dysfunctional because there is no response to the RT Act. But I wanted, with your permission, to mention about this institutional autonomy which we're discussing. I think we are having, first of all, before I start, I must congratulate Justice Patel on an absolutely brilliant lecture on behalf of all of you. Very well discussed. I would really like to have the 9 lectures of Cardinal Newman. All that I heard was the Cardinal Newman definition of a gentleman. That's what we had out of it. I never knew there were 9 lectures, and there are 2 cardinals. I don't think they've been followed very well too much lately, but anyway. So, the basic institute, the danger I find today, that more than the Film Certification Board, is the destruction of autonomy of education institutions, particularly medical colleges and schools. And I must tell you that I think a lot blame must lie at the hands of the judiciary, with utmost respect. And if you just go back, people tend to forget the first decision to start this private-public was by N.G. Ramchandran, MGR, the famous film star and so on. And he had a very simple formula. He was uneducated, and he realized that the only place where a person can uplift himself is through education. And he had a simple formula. He told liquor dealers in Tamil Nadu, please give your money for education. And he had a simple formula: start a medical college, start an engineering college, 50% seats you do what you want, and 50% you give it for merit. That was a simple formula, but that got drastically eroded, and as you rightly put it, now it's become completely opposite. And this lack of autonomy is really destroying the character of education. And every year, at least in the Madras High Court, June, July, you have a separate medical bench. The bench only for medical and engineering college cases. It's really sad to see students and their parents crowding for admission. That's one thing. And I must say that the RT Act has completely destroyed institutional autonomy. It has really, really hampered RTE, at least in Madras, from what I find, talking to teachers and so on and so forth. It completely counterproductive, destroyed institutional autonomy. The other thing I want to mention of autonomy is the autonomy of tribunals, right? Because we are talking of democratic governance and the rule of law is fundamental to governance. I find that as far as tribunals are concerned, there is a complete reluctance to have it independent. We have been fighting a battle for the last 10 years. They put all tribunals in a ministry of law. All tribunals are governed by the respective ministries. If you take the IPAB, which we argued today in the Supreme Court, it is part of a department in the Commerce Ministry. And a report goes as to what the IPAB is functioning. They have no autonomy, they have no function, they have no... So that is the danger we should be more worried about. Tribunals, education, and so on. And yeah, that's what I wanted to mention.
So if we keep educational institutions to one side, take other institutions that ought to be autonomous, but there are tensions that take us away from that autonomy, some of which you mentioned. Is there any justification for moving towards an American-like system where the institutions are clearly not autonomous of government in the sense that they are party political appointments to a whole host of executive institutions, including regulators, tribunals of various shades, and the other bodies? And then the people know that this is a Republican appointee and this is an appointee who is going to behave in a certain way. We seem to be stuck in a situation where there seems to be some idea that this institution ought to be acting autonomously, but it's not. So do you think that perhaps we should be more transparent in our functioning, that the film certification body is going to be a political appointee, so we should know that this is a political appointee that has been made for party political reasons?
That would be problematic, because then you've got a state-run propaganda, which is nobody's case. It's the state determining television or state determining cinema and then art. That's nobody's case. There's another area which needs greater study, which is the functioning autonomy of planning bodies for town and country planning, wildlife advisory boards, and so on and so forth. These have a huge impact far beyond the confines of a narrow statute. And when they are being driven by political or financial concerns toward predefined result, the statutory purpose is often being lost. And this is happening with wildlife protection, and it is certainly happening with the planning of our cities throughout this country. Now that's something that we need to address. This problem of medical admissions and the medical bench is true. I had the misfortune of serving on one for the last 3 months, every single day to go.
Well, I'll follow on from that wildlife protection example, because that ties in nicely with the documentary we showed right at the beginning. Because it seems that these statutory institutions, whether it be the Pollution Control Board or it be Wildlife Advisory Board, seem to be failing. As in it's possibly a reflection of the fact that the environment isn't high enough on anybody's political agenda, which is why they are allowed to fail. But they are failing. And as a result of which courts are stepping into the breach. But I won't put you on the spot, so put Mr. Gautam on the spot of this one, even you might have to hear some matters in relation to this. But courts are stepping into the breach, but what we find is that courts appear to, some of the time at least, lose their legitimacy because their judgments are not being implemented. As you could see, 6 years later, no compensation has been given. The frothing water in Telangana outside Hyderabad continues, lifespan of folks reduces. Hula is a classic example in front of us. So do you think that this kind of counteractive effect, that statutory bodies are failing because they are not autonomous, so courts are stepping into the breach in order to correct that, but it seems to me that courts are perhaps failing in their results, and perhaps some would say that sometimes also losing their own autonomy in the process?
Well, I think it would be unfair to say that none of the court judgments are being implemented. The documentary does highlight cases where the judgments have not been implemented. In fact, Arun Shuri's book, Courts and the Judgments, is a whole litany of cases where the orders are not enforced. But at the same time, I think I would say that there are many cases where the judiciary's orders have been implemented. For example, in Tirupur, the entire pollution has been completely stopped. The distillery had the occasion to apply for the farmers in the sugar matter. So where they would just take water from the upper side and after using it for distillery, because making of molasses is highly polluted, they would just put it to the lower river. That has completely stopped. So I would also, like you have done a documentary, you can also try and find out where court orders have been implemented. So it would be very unfair to say that nothing is being implemented. I know many cases where sand mining has been stopped, illegal tree felling has been stopped. In fact, but for Gautam, lots of forests are today protected because of the judiciary. So I think that let's have a balance, and when you make your documentary, I hope you said present some good pictures also with the court order. Part 2, documentary part 2.
That's what I was going to say. That might be the prequel. That might. Well, usually nowadays the prequel comes after the movie, so maybe we could do that. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. So I think we've got a range of issues here in terms of institutions with autonomy. I already see a hand up, Mr. Vidhi from the Finance Commission.
No, I'm here on behalf of Finance Commission.
In his personal capacity.
My person. Justice Patel, what worries me is that sometimes in a country like ours, there is a problem of information asymmetry. Educational institutions, private institutions, sometimes advertise wrongly, and people who don't know things very properly. I know of cases where they have been misled in taking up admission. So a paternalistic approach where you infringe on institutional autonomy sometimes is to protect from this information asymmetry. Now, this can be abused, of course. And if I may add another to the tale, how far institutional autonomy is failing, because the system of name and shame is not working. You may have that autonomy in statute, but you don't exercise it because you are compromising your own position.
I think we can take a couple.
The best response is some illustrations from recent cases in court. But I must tell you, this level of control you're talking about is quite absurd. The regulator counts every stick of furniture, literally every stick of furniture. And the reports to courts are typically statements like this. Sanction refused because ventilation in the library is inadequate. Not enough fans, not enough windows, no fans. I have no idea. You shut down an institute on this basis. If it's only a question of fans, you call an electrician, put it in tomorrow. It can't be that severe. Then there are cases about statements about staff not being approved. But the approval is by the regulator, and that takes 3 years. In the meantime, there's the staff and it has to be paid. So I don't see how people are going to be able to do this. There is not quite that mismatch in advertisements, because even the advertisements for admissions are all regulated and done through a centralized body. Nobody is applying to a college because of an ad the college puts out. It's really not going to do very much. It's just the applications for medical admissions across the whole of Maharashtra that are done in one ad, or all of engineering. And for some peculiar reason, I can't understand everybody wants to go to government law college. No, I don't know. I think it was close to the High Court. I don't think
There are 2 questions there, one here and one here.
Yes, good evening. My question is that now that you've spoken of the need for greater autonomy, these institutions which you've spoken of may or may not be, creatures of statute. However, they do not independently exist as isolated, sort of monadic institutes. They have the society we live in now, Internet of Things, everything is connected. So my question is this: that in trying to give a greater level of autonomy, and whilst also understanding there is a certain level of regulation required, how can we encourage these institutions to enter dialogue with one another, yet retain their autonomy, their functional and structural autonomy, yet function with each other without insidious encroachments?
This simple, quick, facetious answer to that is adopt the Zuckerberg paradigm and go on Facebook. I don't think there is any other structural mechanism by which we'll be able to get institutions to talk intelligibly and intelligently with each other. They have to first look at how they're managing their own affairs and whether that conforms to any kind of a valuable archetype. That's the real problem. I don't think the integration itself is an issue. That will happen. One will follow the other.
The question just behind there.
Hello, Justice Patel. It was a pleasure to listen to that lecture. I was particularly keen to understand one particular point you mentioned about how autonomy needs to be viewed in light of functional autonomy, the way in which a function is carried out by this autonomous institution. It is of particular interest to me to understand how the definition of a function for an institution interacts with that autonomy. How should we define a function so as to be able to ensure that autonomy is secured or not secured? A couple of examples just to explain this in relation with the bodies under the RTI. Recently was a remark from the Supreme Court saying that people need to be able to show locus so as to be able to demand information. That seems to be counter to, say, a function of these bodies to be able to give information regardless of the purpose. That sort of definition, would it need to be in place beforehand? Does it need to be written in law? Or for courts, which enter into questions of policy, whereas they should be defining themselves to have a function related to disputes under law. How does one define it in those circumstances? And I'm also interested, perhaps this might not really not go into this question, but if, for example, if it is difficult for a function to be carried out, if it is difficult for a function to be assessed, for example, to check whether or not a person has or has not suffered religious persecution, should that be a function that is to be assigned to a state authority at all?
I'm saying that you can't deny an institution the right to take that call, that's one. And on the RTI, I think I actually wasn't on the question of locus or what Chief Justice said. That may be in a different context. But have a look at the recent amendments to the RTI Act and the exceptions that have been carved out. And the reasons for those exceptions, some of them are utterly bizarre. One of the reasons you can deny information is for commercial confidence. What does that mean? So if you want to know whether the builder in whose project you bought a building has got a sanction for his plans, you can't get that because that violates commercial confidence. This is what we were told. And it hits you when you're dealing with intellectual property or just about anything. What is commercial confidence? In the context of a query going to the government.
I was just thinking that, a recurring theme when we talk about institutional failure or regulatory failure is also linked to the composition of these institutions themselves, where sometimes greater autonomy translates into greater technocratic expertise versus, let's say, public participation. So I just wondered how you see the composition of these institutions as playing a role in determining their autonomy.
Oh, it's crucial, and that's actually another entire debate about how we are populating or rejigging the composition of these tribunals and these authorities compared to what we were doing 40 or 50 years ago, and how we're bringing planned or cooperative officers to man these institutions. We saw, I think, in the 50s and 60s, up to the 70s, a level of bureaucratic independence that we've almost entirely lost here now. And then I don't know why that has gone the way it has gone.
Question here.
Justice Patel, my question is with regards to the reasonable restrictions that are imposed in freedom of speech and expression, and two of the grounds are decency or morality. And when you have such grounds that are itself subjective, then where does the buck stop when the state wants to curb your freedom of speech and expression?
That's the point.
There's a question here.
Good evening, Mrs. Patel. I had a small question. When you ended your talk, you ended it with that we have a choice to make. I just wanted to understand how can public participation help institutions to retain the autonomy that they exercise right now?
I actually will not answer that question.
I just want to mention in the light of what Vidhi also asked, one thing is our statutes must give independence to the institute. You create an institute, say for example the Arbitration Act, this 2019 amendment, you have an Arbitration Advisory Council, and that's manned more by bureaucrats. So why the hell do you want an arbitration council to be man-controlled by the government. And I find the last at least 15 years, a tendency to over-regulate each and every activity of life, and that's also destroys institutional autonomy. I think we have to get back to the basic requirement of the right to be left alone. Institutions also should be allowed to be left alone to do what they want with limited interference.
So I think at the end of the day, a basic requirement that office holders have some fidelity to their
job. I'm not saying run amok.
That's right.
I'm not saying run amok, but then you can't have a situation where everything is regulated by the government.
That's right. Yes. There has to be a correction.
Then don't create an institution.
That's right.
You don't create a GST tribunal manned by bureaucrats who are going to decide against the SSC.
The question there.
So, Mr. Datta mentioned that the RT Act affects the autonomy of certain institutions, private institutions in RT Act, the Right to Education Act. So, usually this is raised in the context of the provision of the RT Act, which mandates private schools to reserve 25% of their seats to children from disadvantaged groups. But at the same time, this provision promotes inclusion of such children. So where do we find that balance that you have to preserve the autonomy and also promote inclusion?
I have no quarrel with the 25% quota at all. That's good. What is bothersome is that how do you select those students? Now in Madras, the matter is pending in the Supreme Court. Now what the Tamil Nadu, what they've done is all your seats have to be given to a common pool to the government. Then the government will have, then you are supposed to say which is your school. Then they have got an app or a Google map which is your neighborhood, and the government will decide which school goes what, where. So now for example, suppose the elder brother is studying in the school. Typically the younger sister or the brother gets automatic admission. Now what's happening on the ground is because of this kind of over-regulation by the government admission. I was least concerned with this 25%. It's a good thing, I'm not saying no. But the way it is being now, entire admission is taken over. Now the board includes a local politician, a local, very quote-unquote social worker, and then the whole thing is completely lost. And then what do the teachers do? They have no regulation over students who are coming. They have no control over the syllabus. They have to make sure that everybody is educated. Nobody can be failed till the 8th standard. So then, that's what I'm saying. That's why the RT Act, and I've doing some matters for the schools here, and it's been an absolute disaster. And the worst thing is the school fee committee. Now they've got this notion that you put a high court judge, retired high court judge there. The school fee committee is an absolute disaster. You would want students to, teachers to be paid 6 pay commission salaries. In Chennai, you're saying a school can't charge more than 13,000 rupees per year. This is what destroys institutional autonomy. Now, so the RT Act governs the school fee committee, headed by a high court judge. He has 70 admissions.
That actually is a separate fee regulation legislation that's there in Chennai, there's one in Delhi. Yes. Not strictly the RT Act, but I think the problem...
No, I'm saying the overall problem. Autonomy, you destroy...
The problem is one of the state-sponsored software, I think, which is a job of...
I think slowly but surely, schools, I mean, like he mentioned about Harvard, Oxford, you got a school, you say, okay, give 25%, but then let the school choose their own students. You can't give it to a common pool and some computer selects it, and no questions are asked.
We have time for one or two new questions. If there's one here, and we take the last set of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. So.
Good evening, Justice Patel. Thank you for that eloquent lecture. My question was simple. After the lecture, when you were talking about autonomy and accountability coexisting, my inference was from your response that they can coexist. And even though you did not bring up the judiciary in your lecture, I wanted to hear your thoughts on how there have been repeated reports about where the judiciary in some way or the other has indicated that what the public perceives as accountability can actually impinge on their autonomy and independence in their functioning, whereas in some cases people are probably just asking for more transparency in a more contentious case of, say, appointments or something like that. So could I hear some of your thoughts on how your brother judges could tread this balance?
Not on any question relating to appointments, of course, I've got nothing to say on that. But you have to look at the kind of questions that are being asked when it comes to accountability. And let me tell you this is something that not many people realize, but it's true. On a weekly basis, all of us, some more than others, get what I call love letters. They got into a box file called love letters. All kinds of allegations are made, and these are typically addressed to every judge of the High Court, the Chief Justice of the High Court, the the President of India because he appoints us, the Chief Justice of India, and every judge of the Supreme Court. And they go on and on for pages and pages, making all kinds of allegations, including very personal, very intrusive ones. And when you don't respond to this, the next thing that you get is an RTI query. And the next thing after that is an evolutionary process, is a statement that there is no accountability. This is a very real problem. It affects functioning. You have judges who are constantly looking over their shoulders, who are terrified. And the absolute N-level expansion of this is a bunch of lawyers in Bombay, I don't know whether this happened anywhere else, have begun filing complaints before magistrates naming the judge and asking for action. And the poor judge doesn't know the magistrate doesn't know who he's dealing with, because it doesn't say Justice so-and-so. It just says, for example, well, Michael said it hasn't happened, but just as Gautam Patel. So he issues process. And all of this starts the ball rolling. And that gets circulated on social media. And this is all supposed to be in the name of accountability. So unless you're able to define what exactly you mean by judicial accountability, I mean, there are areas where there should be, not saying no. This is too generalized.
The question here.
I just had one question on, because we're talking about institutional autonomy. How do we ensure that an institution is open? Because it is, I think, two set of values which are in constant conflict. In the sense that there is perhaps some reaction for a lot of institutions to close. And I don't single out any institution, it happens in a lot of societies, it happens to a lot of institutions. There's a tendency to close in the name of autonomy. And there is always a risk that the institution withers of how close it becomes. And we're talking about specifically public institutions. It becomes the fiefdom, or it becomes the stranglehold of a certain...
That is a very real risk.
Yeah.
That is actually a very real risk, and that's a good spot. That's a balance, and I don't think that there's one formula that's going to survive time. Each one of those incidents will have to be tested as they come along.
We've got 2-3 questions at the back. We'll take them together. Just keep them short.
Good evening, sir. So I was thinking from terms of, to take your example earlier of the IIT example, where the university gave space to both the parties and asked them to be civil. A lot of this comes from, to speak Foucault's idea of governmentality. The institutions made from the models that underlie the society itself. So clearly, in some ways, what IIT did there was enforce that sort of civil morality that's coming about. So my question is, how can institutes or institutions evolve certain form of philosophies that incorporate certain such moralities, and can the regulators incorporate that within their regulations or encourage the formulation of such morality?
Yeah, we take on. There's one right.
Justice Patel spoke about how the state needs to possibly not impinge on institutional autonomy. My question to you is, do you think that the state can actively promote institutional autonomy as opposed to just merely not impinging it? Do you think it's actually possible? And how do you think it can, if you think it's possible for the state to do so?
There's one last one there.
Justice Patel, my question actually is similar to one just articulated before, in terms of basically the ideology of a particular institution, because I think each institution has a different, there are very different ideologies that different institutions follow. So where there is a liberal ideology, I would be completely on the same page as you are. But what my concern with respect to what you talked about in terms of providing institutional autonomy is insofar as even certain aspects like education is concerned. You have a lot of private liberal arts universities now, which are somewhat shielded from, there is not as much governmental interference. So you actually have some space to articulate and have a lot of dissenting questions to ask. But these institutions are also not immune to certain other pressures, which may be whether it's market forces or there is a particular way in which education has also become commodified. So only certain people who can afford to get a certain type of education can go there. So while I understand that some governmental overreach is problematic, it also ensures that these spaces are accessible to the most marginalized sections of the community. So I'm trying to understand how would you, think about that?
The first question was about ideologies of institutions and how do we ensure that institutions have an ideology that is...
I'm not sure there's a prescriptive model for imposing an ideology, even operational, on an institution of any kind. But to the question of what should governments or regulators do, I think the best example is really when the government is asked to regulate and it says, no, this is autonomous, we respect that decision, we may not agree with it, but it is for that body to decide. And that's when the government needs to start stepping back rather than stepping in. On the question of integration and allowing for a balance between the more expensive seats and accessibility to especially expensive higher education. But there's a very interesting podcast by Malcolm Gladwell precisely on this. Part of his 4-part series, where he addresses this and looks at why very expensive centers of learning in America have a very low proportion of affirmative action intake and others do. One of the points that he makes through this is that the series called Revisionist History, this is season 3 or season 4, is that it's easier for an institute that has a structured policy of using a very high fee to make a defined cap-limited subsidy of those who can't afford it. That's the only way that you can recognize and talent and do this on a need basis. If you take it away from need and put it on the level of, say, caste, then you have the makings of this RTE problem, where a person is deemed to be poor because he has a certain surname, irrespective of the need. That in Mumbai is becoming, in Maharashtra, is a real problem. Because people claim to belong to, actually there are only 2 contentious castes now left. To those castes, they are said that we are by definition backward, impoverished, economically suppressed, and therefore entitled to benefit, automatically. They are swanning around in gas-guzzling SUVs. That's it.
Maybe it's an appropriately dispiriting note to end this. But
I said that's back.
Yeah. So I think that you had quoted Julian Barnes earlier, and I think Julian Barnes, perhaps riffing a bit off Tagore, had written that the greatest patriotism is to tell your country when it is behaving dishonorably. And I think Justice Patel today has told the whole world that perhaps it is time to introspect about the way in which we are going. And if we do love our countries, then perhaps to think really hard about where we stand in our countries today. Thank you very much for a terrific lecture, Justice Patel. And thank you very much. Justice Patel, a small token of our
on behalf of all of you.
Thanks very much for coming, and I hope to see you at future VT events. Thanks again. Hello.